Good morning, everyone. Good evening, wherever in the world you are. My name is Marga Gual Soler, and I am delighted to welcome you to this webinar on science diplomacy in the post-COVID-19 world, organized by the Spanish Embassy in the United States, in Washington, D.C., by the Office of Science and Culture. So thank you so much to the Embassy for giving this space to discuss a very important and trending topic in the current times, which is science, the role of science, the role of diplomacy, and the role they play together, they have played in responding to this pandemic, and the need for more engagement and interaction between these two worlds moving forward. So today we have an extraordinary panel. I am really pleased to introduce you to three fantastic speakers coming from both worlds, the worlds of diplomacy and science, and they have extraordinary careers that I am really excited to hear them talk about. And the way we're going to structure this webinar is that we're going to have a few questions for them to share their views on this topic, and then we're going to open up for all of you to interact and ask your questions. We know that this is an extremely popular topic that has boomed somehow in the past 3 months, and we almost see COVID-19 as a case study, a live case study on science diplomacy, science advice, and the overall interaction between science and policy. So without further ado, I will introduce our three speakers, and we're going to jump into the conversation. So first of all, representing the Spanish Embassy in Washington, D.C., we have Cristina Fraile Jimenez de Muñana, who is the Deputy Chief of Mission of the Embassy, and she is a career diplomat. She's been the DCM since 2015, and she has been posted in a number of positions around the world in the embassies of Spain in Dakar, in Brasilia, the permanent mission of Spain to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, in Vienna, the Embassy of Spain in New Delhi in India, and the Embassy of Spain in Vienna, Austria. Next, we have Dr. Franklin Carrero-Martínez, who is a scientist and academic by training from Puerto Rico, who made the transition to the policy and diplomacy world, and he's going to talk about that today. He was the AAAS Science Technology Policy Fellow, Roger Revelle Fellow in Global Stewardship, and then he moved to a number of positions at the State Department in the Science and Technology Advisor Office to the Secretary of State. Also, he was posted at the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City, and now he is at the National Academies of Science and Engineering in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have Dr. Alicia Pérez-Porro, who is a marine biologist by training, and now she connects gender equality, the oceans, and science diplomacy for sustainable development. She is currently the president of the Association of Spanish Scientists in the United States, known as ECUSA, and also is the president of all the networks of Spanish scientists around the world called Raíces. So with this fantastic panel, we will jump into the conversation. And I would like, first of all, for each of you to give us your brief opinions, your remarks on how this COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need to bring science and diplomacy closer together to address the threats and challenges that no country can solve on its own. We have seen responses from political leaders that have been sometimes unilateral, they have been uncoordinated, and sometimes contradictory. And at the same time, we have seen the response from the scientific community joining together and rallying against the clock to understand this new disease and find a vaccine and cures and treatments as fast as possible. So how do you see this process that has played out in the last 3 months since the outbreak, and how the science and diplomacy pieces have connected and this relationship has unfolded? And then I will ask you to also think about the future, and how do you see this affecting the international system? Will science play a more central role in diplomacy and multilateral institutions, or are we going to see a retreat or more competition and countries and nations turning inwards in the face of global challenges? So with this first question, I would like to start with Cristina to give us the perspective from a diplomat on this. So please, Cristina.
Thank you very much, Marga, and thank you very much for the Cultural Office of the Embassy of Spain for organizing this event, and to my other two fellow panelists. I think the political response to the crisis created by COVID-19 has triggered the necessity to get diplomacy and science closer in a much more dramatic way, because the concepts of science diplomacy has not been created because of the COVID-19 crisis. It has been there for quite a long time, and some of us have been working on it both from the diplomatic side and from the scientific side for quite a few years. But it has been a very dramatic representation of how diplomats and scientists need to get closer together. As the political, of course, they have a national initial response. I think this is inevitable, and some countries might be imposed to have, from the very beginning of the crisis, pointed out to the necessity of a global coordinated response. Our government has been extremely vocal in this, and in particular our Minister for Foreign Affairs has been very vocal, has published several pieces on the matter, calling attention to the fact that the response to this crisis needs to be global, or it will fail. I mean, no country will be able to get out of this on its own. We can maybe elaborate a little bit more on this later in the program, but I will stop at this point.
Sorry, muted. Thank you so much, Cristina. Let's move to Franklin.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Marga. Thank you, Alicia and Cristina. Thank you to the Spanish Embassy for the kind invitation. I'd like to start by highlighting that I am now at the National Academy of Sciences, which is a non-government organization. It was founded by Abraham Lincoln and Congress about 150 years ago, with the purpose of advising the nation on issues of science, engineering, and medicine. From that perspective, and also putting in context my previous roles in government and academia, I think I am pleased to know that we have, in a lot of different countries, scientists and diplomats that are trained with the sensitivity to work with each other. It takes two sides to do these kind of things, especially in a moment of crisis, when we're bringing together very rapidly a lot of different people to address literally a global challenge. And this moment where we're now talking about science diplomacy as a way to bridge the gap in literally the global stage of how we need to address COVID and these challenges comes because there have been many years of a community building on all sides to make sure that we have this. One of the things that I would like to highlight is that at this particular moment, it's not just science and diplomats that need to come together. COVID is highlighting the fact that there's a very strong angle on the economy. So economists also need to come to the conversation. It's a new disease. There's a lot of things that we still don't know, we're still not sure. And while the scientific community is figuring out those things, we need to engage with professional communicators to ensure that when we're communicating policies and then when we're communicating ideas, do we wear masks? Do we not wear masks? Do we wash our hands so frequently or not? All of those things require a good way to communicate to the general public that may not necessarily be aware of how science is evolving literally by the minute these days, with the amount of information that is being produced and the amount of resources that are now shifted to address COVID. So while science diplomacy could play and should play, and it's playing a central role, I think we still need to do a better job at integrating other disciplines to ensure that we protect the economy, the public, and other parts of society.
Absolutely. Fantastic, Franklin. Thank you so much. Let's go with Alicia for your opening remarks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm truly honored. Thank you to the embassy and to my fellow panelists. So I think that my perspective is a little bit of wishful thinking, because like it depends very much on the type of government. And some governments don't think that science is that important, or they are not enhancing science so much. And on the other hand, we are also discovering that some other governments, like Cristina mentioned, our government, the Spanish government, is highlighting the importance of science absolutely everywhere. I think that a little bit of like following the thought that Franklin started, I think that this crisis has like not only science now is in the spotlight. I think that we are broadening our definition of science, and I think that we need to continue on that path of communicating that science is way more than just research, and that there are a lot of factors in science that are equally important to connect science and diplomacy and to act in a global crisis like it is COVID-19, but also the climate emergency, for instance. So I think that we still need to work on broadening this definition of science and make it clear that science diplomacy and science policy and science communication and all of this is part of this like big tree of science, and all of the actors and all of the parts are key to address global crisis. And I think that it's like what Cristina said, it's completely true. We are not going to get out of any global crisis without cooperation and international cooperation. And I think that a lot of governments are on board on this like vision. And hopefully in those countries where this message is still not that clear, the population are going to push for that.
Great. Alicia, thank you so much. I think the perspective from all three of you is that we need to broaden the scope of this conversation beyond just science and diplomacy. And I think this is a very, sometimes very aspirational conversation. So I would like to, for the second round of comments, to get a little bit more specific, right? In science diplomacy, we have sometimes this, ideas and aspirations that then at the implementation stage is when it gets tricky. So I will ask you now in the second round to discuss a little bit more concrete the role that, of the sector that you represent, being the diplomatic community, the scientific community, the national academies, and other actors in strengthening these connections and building these ecosystems for being better prepared for the next crisis, be it a health crisis or climate or environmental crisis or any other issue that is transnational by nature, and we're going to be forced to do this exercise again. So what are the strategies, structures, mechanisms that facilitate this engagement between science and diplomacy, both from the perspective of Spain and the US, which are the two countries that we are bridging today? So I will start with Cristina again to give us a little bit of how Spain approaches science diplomacy and what are the instruments and mechanisms and strategies that that have been implemented and or are in your diplomatic roadmap.
Thank you, Marga. Let me start by saying that in my career as a diplomat, I have never seen the intersection between science and diplomacy as clearly as in this position in the US. It has been since I arrived here in 2015 that I saw, that I realized how critical it is, the role, first of all, the role of the embassy in helping put together the two scientific communities between Spain and the United States. It is also because of the vibrancy of the scientific community in the United States, a very important part of which is the is the Spanish scientific community, and we have in Alicia a very clear representative of that. So it was when I arrived here that I saw it clearly that diplomacy needs science and science needs diplomacy. It has been ever since then that I have been more and more interested in finding all these intersections between science and diplomacy and how we can help each other. And I can give you many examples, but let me start by saying that in this embassy and in other key embassies of Spain in the world, we need to have a scientific approach. We need to have a scientific advisor integrated in the embassy. We've had the chance of having one. When I arrived here, we had a wonderful scientific advisor, Ana Elorza. I think some of you know her, and I miss her dearly every day since she left. And I really pray that very soon we will get a new cultural and scientific advisor who has already been appointed and will be joining us very soon, and will be able to carry out this key work in providing a scientific vision to our diplomatic work, and also helping to establish the links between the two communities and the scientific authorities of the United States. We have improved in these years since we started working since 2015, when Spain first started adopting a scientific strategy for our diplomacy. We have improved in many ways. First of all, we now have embassies that have a dedicated person for these activities for scientific diplomacy. We have trainees from the Spanish Agency for Cooperation and Development, trainees in scientific diplomacy, and we have just been very briefly in contact with our trainee for the Spanish Embassy in Washington, D.C. And very critically, we have introduced scientific training, specific training for our diplomats. This is something that I believe is of critical importance. And I'm in touch very recently with the director of our diplomatic academy in Madrid, and has confirmed that now we join the Spanish diplomatic service in a specific training on science diplomacy, get to visit before they are sent abroad. They get to visit the most important scientific institutions in Madrid. We have introduced as well scientific specific training for all those diplomats who are not new to the career, but who are just about to join their positions abroad. So this is now part of our training. I think this is a very important improvement, because I think it is the key for me. I always like to talk about science diplomacy in terms that diplomats need to get more scientific, and scientists need to get more diplomatic. So I think we are moving in the right direction, and I think events like this that help us share our views and get together help us get better tools and imagine better what we need to acquire in order to be better scientific diplomats, all of us.
Absolutely. I think we're in Spain, we've done quite a bit of progress in a short time, right? Just a few years, compared to other countries, like, for instance, the United States, that has a very long tradition of having scientists at the embassies and science advisors to the foreign ministries. And so on that, I would like to invite Franklin to tell us a bit more of how it works in the US and what was your experience in your journey, because you've been part of pretty much every actor in the science diplomacy ecosystem. So please tell us about your journey and how this ecosystem works in the US.
So maybe how it used to work, but we don't want
yes.
to get I'm going to pick up on something that Cristina mentioned, and I really like it, because this is something that we have been working on. When we define and we think about science diplomacy, I see it from two different complementary angles. So you have the diplomat that have an interest or sensitivity to science, and then you have the scientists that have an interest on diplomacy. And that space, in my mind, is the collection of what science diplomacy is. You have people that have a long career, understand UN processes, understand negotiations, understand bilateral and multilateral relations, understand the political component, understand the economic, cultural component. That's one lane, but then at the same time, you have scientists that understand, that study anthropology, that study political science, that study the economy, hard sciences, biology, physics, all of these different dimensions. And you need them together when we're talking about advancing global goals. I know that Alicia mentioned briefly the sustainable development, the SDGs, the climate crisis, all of those things beyond COVID require that interaction between scientists and diplomats. Here in the US, I will start with a study that the National Academies did in 1999 that led to the creation of the Office of the Science Advisor. So here in the US, it's a complex web of different actors from non-government sector, private sector, government, at the federal level, state level, and even at the local level. With their own vision, with their own plan, and that's what makes the ecosystem in the US a bit complex. Nevertheless, in this example that I'm bringing up, the academies put together this study, the pervasive role of science, technology, and innovation in foreign affairs, came out in 1999. The report is free for everyone, nap.edu. It's free for anyone to download. That report, amongst many other things, recommended the creation of the Office of the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. That's an example of how non-government in the US advises the government to take action to ensure that science advice is incorporated within the structure. Populating that and bringing scientists to government and to facilitate the transition, there are programs like the AAAS Science and Technology Fellowship. It's a program that I joined in 2012. At the time, I was a tenured professor at the University of Puerto Rico. I had a research lab in neuroscience, and I decided to take a sabbatical leave and try something else. And that fellowship allowed me to explore for a year the world of science diplomacy. And as you know, academia is not kind to those that leave academia, but a fellowship provides that protective space to try something out. So according to data that I've seen from AAAS, half of the fellows go back to government, stay in government, and the other half go back to academia. So I think a fellowship, it's a good mechanism to ensure that you have that protective time, you learn, and if you go back to academia, now you have a deeper understanding of how government structures work, whether it's advice, whether it's policy options, implementation of policies, etc., depending on the agency that you go to, which, by the way, when you go back to academia, now you may be more open to have your own students follow a different path, which is also very critical. Often in academia, we see professors that want to clone their students, and if they go to some other thing, other careers, they might have sold their souls to the devil because they went away and did something else. And I think this fellowship, whether you go back again or stay in government, allows for the fellow to have a broader view, a broader perspective, different fields, and know that really your student could make a difference if they follow a different path.
Thank you, Franklin. I see Alicia agreeing furiously with you. Because in Spain, we still don't have that kind of ecosystem of government and outside of government institutions or boundary institutions that we call them, that can facilitate those trainings and experiences to expose both communities to each other. So Alicia, why don't you tell us, how do you see this view from Spain and compared to the US where you are right now?
So I think that it's really interesting what you, Cristina, said at the beginning about how you never saw this connection between science and diplomacy so clearly since since you came to the US. And I think that this is very much my experience. Since I've been living in the US, I think that I moved here in 2009. And so it's been a couple of years now. And that's one of my main learnings about living in this country, and it goes relates with what Franklin just said about the ecosystem in the US is complex, but there is an ecosystem, and there are a lot of opportunities for connection between science and diplomacy, and not all of them relate to the government. You can be also outside the government and advising the government. And as I was saying, this is my main takeaway from my experience in the US, that here, when you say that you're a scientist, people don't understand immediately that you are a researcher, because scientist in the US means a lot of different things, not only research. And I think that I don't see that in Spain. I think that in Spain, when you say that you're a scientist, most of the people immediately understand that you're doing research. And then you have to explain, no, I don't do research. I do like science policy or science diplomacy, or I work for an NGO. And for some people, that's a concept that is completely new and requires a little bit of explanation. I think that part of the reason is because, as Franklin was saying, here in the US, you have training. And this training, it's not only for people that want to transition, it's also for people that don't want to transition, that just want the knowledge and go back to the lab and allow other paths for their students. And this is what I miss in Spain. I know that Spain is like doing a lot of efforts to connect science and diplomacy, and I think that it's admirable, all the things that the Spanish government has been doing to create this ecosystem of science diplomacy in the last couple of years. And as Cristina was saying, now diplomats have training in science, and that's fantastic. I think that from the other side, the side of like me being a scientist, I think that we lack a little bit of formal training, because we don't have anything similar to the AAAS fellowship that Franklin was mentioning. And this is, I think, a systemic problem, because then PIs don't see other career alternatives, not all of them, but most of them don't see alternative careers, or science diplomacy is not an alternative career. And I think that this is where associations like ECUSA can bring a little bit of this, because like we don't give formal training by any means, but we, like in ECUSA, one of the pillars of ECUSA is career development. And we are always making sure that this career development involves absolutely every aspect of science, not only research. And actually, you, Marga, got invited to give a talk at ECUSA a couple of months ago about science diplomacy. And since you gave that talk, we've been getting a lot of emails, about, can you say more? Can you, when is this video going to be available? Are you thinking about giving training? And so the interest from the science community is there. And now we just need a better understanding of what is the path. Because I think that there's a lot of mystery in how to follow the path of science diplomacy, because you don't hear very much this word and this concept in Spain. So you, like, when a scientist that is doing research wants to transition outside research and follow this science diplomacy path, they, and by they I mean also we, because I am in this path, sometimes it's difficult and you are completely lost because you don't really have a clear understanding of what to do or which door you have to knock.
Absolutely. Thanks for that mention. I'm very glad that there's an interest in the ECUSA community in this topic. I think it's important to remember what Franklin said, that it's not about scientists leaving academia and becoming policymakers or politicians. There's also a bit of misunderstanding in that aspect, that we are not asking people to leave the lab and completely change careers, even though some of them do, and then they become these boundary people that can navigate both worlds because they've been trained and exposed to both. So it is, I think, more of an exposure that both communities, as Cristina was saying, and Franklin, that need to be exposed to each other, rather than, you know, maybe the PIs are scared that we're going to take all the PhDs out of the lab and just, you know, leave them without lab staff. So it is, I think it's important to make that distinction. In terms of the AAAS fellowship, I worked for 5 years at the Center for Science Diplomacy, and one of our projects was actually to try to internationalize these fellowship models. Some countries are doing it, but it was always in the research and in the process of talking to many countries about this, and Franklin has been part of those conversations, and Ana Elorza, which was mentioned by Cristina, was also part of those conversations. It is the culture, and it is this resistance and the unknown. Like, what do you mean by training a scientist in policies? Are you going to politicize them? So there's still a lot that we need to do to make this trainings and options, I think, viable, and also not threatening to any of those two, because I think Cristina can also tell us a bit about how sometimes diplomats, have perceived that scientists are going to take their jobs. Like, are you going to replace me for scientists? And so how does that in practice inside an embassy? Can you give us a bit of a day, a day in your life? How do you, what specific scientific questions or negotiations, agreements, things that you have to do in your life as a diplomat that require this scientific expertise, and how this interaction works in practice? Starting with Cristina, so I'm going to ask Cristina and Franklin to give us an example of a real life science diplomacy process that they were part of.
Thank you for that, Amanda. And what you were discussing before made me think of back in 2018, I had the opportunity and the honor to participate in the first international networking on science diplomacy that took place in Madrid, and they adopted the Madrid Declaration on science diplomacy that then went on in Berlin and stuff. And the activity that I took part in at that networking activity was a very simple in concept, but extremely effective. It was a scientist and a diplomat, that was myself, and it was a conversation, a public conversation between the two of us, just to present each other and to make it known to the public how similar we are and how well we can actually interact together. So to go back to your question, the examples on how diplomacy and science interact. I think diplomacy needs science, and it is very apparent and very clear in the sense that we need to base our decision-making process on facts and scientific truths, not on assumptions, not on politics, although politics do have an influence in our decision-making process, but we need to base our policy-making process on facts and scientific truths. In negotiations, I remember when I was a legal advisor, I took part in the negotiation of a UNESCO treaty on the protection of underwater cultural heritage. And I was there as a lawyer. Law is, by the way, also a science, a social one, but I was there as a lawyer. But we needed this constant support of archaeologists, of underwater archaeologists, to give us the facts on which we could base our positions for the negotiation. So that was a very clear example, and that was back in 2000, so 20 years ago already. Our teams had to be interactive, and we needed, it was the diplomats who were carrying out the negotiations, but sitting next to us, we had the scientists that from which we got the scientific advice. We need to interact with the scientific community, and this is very clear right now. We need to do that in order to tackle global problems such as this pandemic, but also other very pressing global problems such as climate change. The interaction between science and diplomacy is absolutely essential in order to fight climate change. And then science needs diplomacy, because in negotiating, for example, research contracts or research agreements across borders, scientists do need the support of diplomats and people who, like Franklin has just very clearly pointed out, to have the know-how of how this process and negotiations go. In negotiating intellectual property agreements, or in being clear about what your visa allows you to do or not to do, or how long you're allowed to stay in a country or not. So these are some just few examples. There are many more, but I think they are very expressive of this interaction between science and diplomacy and how we need to work together.
Thanks, Cristina. I think this is a very important point. And when we think about diplomats helping science, sometimes we think about large infrastructures like CERN, right? Negotiating treaties for scientific infrastructure, but also we have to think of the micro science diplomacy, which is, as you say, scientists need visas, they need research permits, they need to do field work in any part of the world. And to get into that country, to get into that field work site, that requires a diplomatic process. Somebody needs to do, in the consulate. And so sometimes this is written off as bureaucracy, right? And many scientists are not sensitive to the idea of this is part of the science diplomatic process and the agreements, and they write it off as, oh, this is bureaucracy, paperwork. Like, it is not valued as an integral part that the diplomats help scientists to conduct their work anywhere in the world. So thank you for that. Franklin, you've been part of many bilateral, multilaterals, all sorts of negotiations and processes involving science and diplomacy. Please share some of those with us.
So I will share a little bit the process, and then I will go into maybe one example that I am allowed to talk about. So when I was at the Office of the Science Advisor, one of the things that we did was to focus on, let's say, the solving or helping solve the science variable. So I see scientific advice in the context of diplomacy and foreign relations as a very complex equation. And science will always have an answer. But that answer in the context of the cultural, diplomatic, economic, geopolitical equations, the output of that advice may be completely different. Just to maybe put it in context, the advice on what we do about collaboration on 5G would look very different if it's Spain versus China or Russia. So the scientific answer may be one, but then when you add the other variables, then the answer may look completely different. And I recently read a report also, scientists between the UK and Sweden arguing who got the right COVID response, the strategy for the country. We don't know the full answer yet, but I would guess that when you take into consideration culture, how people live and how society functions, maybe at the end, both answers were correct. I know if we had the Sweden policy in Puerto Rico, it would be a complete disaster because we will be partying, we will be in the beach, we will be doing a lot of these other things that it's in our nature, it's a culture, it's a part of society. So scientists, again, there may be an answer from a scientific, in the case of COVID, public health point of view. But then when we add all of these other dimensions, then the answer may look slightly different. So that's something that from a scientific advisory point of view, we'll have to take into consideration when carrying that work. Here at the academies, in the midst of the difficult relationship that we're having with China, at the academies, we held a workshop last December. The report came out last week on US-China collaboration on urban sustainability. Why do we do that in the midst of all of this? Because we need to ensure that our scientists are still able to collaborate. We still need to ensure that there's communication. We need to ensure that there's no room for misunderstanding, that there is a path for our scientists to communicate. We did that with the Russians during Cold War. We're doing that with the Chinese now. We did that with the Cubans at some point in the recent past, and I know Marga was involved in some of those conversations when she was at AAAS. We've done that with Iran in the past. So also that's another dimension of science diplomacy. Sometimes it does not occur through official government channels. Sometimes it takes place outside where academic institutions, academies, and other actors play a role in keeping that conversation going. So I just want to put that in context because diplomacy happens at many levels, and we all could play a role in ensuring that we have good relations with our neighbors, allies, and not so friendly colleagues around the world.
Exactly. Thank you, Franklin. I think it's important, the idea of science not dictating policy. Policy is made by a number of, influenced by a number of factors, and sometimes perhaps we scientists tend to say, oh, this is the answer, or this is how we solve climate change. But we miss the economic, the cultural, the religious. There are so many other factors that will influence whatever that policy response is, and of course context dependent, as we've seen with COVID-19. So we're going to go back to COVID-19. Before we start with the questions, I see some of the attendees putting the hand up. The way we're going to take questions is with is written questions in the Q&A. So if you go to the bottom of your screen in Zoom, there's a Q&A. So we cannot open the microphone because the way this is set up. So please, those of you with the hand up, go and write up your question in the Q&A field. So the first question that we're going to tackle, it's a complex one, but I think it's really appropriate. It's about the idea of the multilateral system. What is the role of, for instance, WHO or a supranational organization like the EU in responding to this crisis, right? So we've seen a lot of criticism to the WHO and to the UN in general, countries saying, I'm going to leave this structure because it doesn't do anything for me, for my country, right? And a lot of misleading communication. So for Cristina, as a diplomat, can you perhaps illuminate us a little bit on how does an intergovernmental structure like the WHO work? What it can, it cannot do? Like can it go and tell China to show their data, or can they go into a country and tell them what to do? So how does that national versus the supranational level play out in a crisis like coronavirus, for instance?
Thank you. It's a very interesting and very relevant question right now, because like you said, we've seen a lot of criticism to the international multilateral system. And our answer to that is that multilateral organizations are not there to replace governments, are there to help governments come and reach common solutions. They are structures that help us channel governmental views and reach a global a compromise, in fact. It is not possible for an international organization to replace any government or to force any government to do anything. Probably the only body that is able to impose itself is the United Nations Security Council, and we are seeing how the international polarization is preventing the Security Council from adopting positions. Spain's view, like I said at the beginning, we have been very adamant and very clear in supporting the multilateral system as the only one who can help us channel a global solution for the global pandemic. We believe that the WHO needs to be reformed and revitalized and given more tools to be able to find a solution. We believe that other international organizations such as the G7 or the G20 or the World Bank or the OECD need to take part in the global conversation, like Franklin said at the beginning, because we need to integrate all the answers, the economic one, the scientific one, the epidemiological one, and the political one to the crisis. So Spain has been at the forefront of those advocating for a global solution, for reinforcing the multilateral framework, not debilitating it, and funding it. And and Spain has been contributing to multilateral initiatives such as this global collaboration initiative to accelerate research on treatment, on vaccines. We are funding initiatives like Gavi in order to get quicker to a vaccine and to more effective treatments. And we support all those global initiatives that foster international cooperation, because we truly believe this is the only way out.
Thank you. Franklin, Alicia, do you want to comment on this question as well?
I do want to say something about how important it is to connect science and diplomacy also at the multilateral level, in terms of that it is important for not only for diplomats, but also for the society to understand that science is uncertain, and that scientists, we are comfortable with our uncertainties, because that's what we do, and that's our training. That you are constantly researching answers, and these answers may change in the future if you discover a new aspect, or if you prove that one of your theories was wrong. And I think that a lot of not a lot, but like some countries and some societies, they want black and white answers, and science moves very much in the gray. And I think that that's important for society to understand, because when they say that maybe WHO was changing minds and they said 2 months ago that this was right and now this thing is wrong, it's also because the science has been moving really fast in this crisis, and this virus is really new, and we are discovering things every day. And these new discoveries make these multilateral actors to change a little bit their perspective. So it is important to understand that science moves in these uncertainties, gray area.
Exactly. So perhaps the communication of the scientific process, and we have a question about that in the Q&A, about the basic of scientific thinking, right? The scientific method, how science works and how fast science can work. We cannot have a vaccine tomorrow, right? There's no way to accelerate certain processes. So perhaps that communication to the public and to the policymakers needs to be also strengthened, so there are no expectations on science that it cannot meet. Franklin, please.
But also, I think working with trusted communicators, whatever there may be. So there may be the weather person that is talking about environmental phenomena. It may be the news anchor. One of the things that I've seen that I think highlights this is all of these models and forecasts that say there's so many deaths or peak is going to be around this date. A lot of the reporting that I've seen drop out all of the caveats that the models have. And that's the core of any model. What are the caveats? What are the assumptions? What are the limitations? And of course, when you're talking about that, it becomes a little complicated and then difficult to communicate. But I think that part is essential when you're communicating the science. And sometimes, unfortunately, can't be simplified to a soundbite, which is what often Twitter, Facebook posts, social media is looking for. So I'm not sure where and how you find that balance, but I think we from the scientific community need to do a better job at finding ways to articulate that to be more effective and ensure that people continue to trust the science and the evidence that is presented. And all of this in the case of COVID, while the information and understanding continues to evolve. We started the pandemic with a few health things that we were paying attention, and now we're talking about COVID dose, and we're talking about a lot of other things that at the beginning it was not even in our radar. So that's an example of how rapidly some things have evolved and how we need to make sure that the general public comes along with us to prevent losing faith and prevent also the disinformation and the conspiracy theories that unfortunately could come out from miscommunicating science.
Absolutely. I'm thinking about, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, WHO put this statement about the asymptomatic carriers not being very contagious. And what they meant was that they made a clear difference between asymptomatic and then pre-symptomatic and pauci-symptomatic, like all of these different ways of not showing symptoms, but maybe developing them later or never developing. But the soundbite that made headlines was, oh my God, WHO now says that we don't have to worry about asymptomatic spreading. So why we've done all this, 3 months of masks and confinement. So it is extremely important what you just said, to really find a way to be accurate, but also to be accessible, right? So how do we find that balance in the evolving evidence process that Alicia just mentioned, because we're learning about this as we go, and nobody has all the answers. Perfect. So we have a couple of more questions that's our friend Nicolas from Chile. Considering the coordination could always be faster, open, and transparent, what actor is necessary to create or promote this networking or this ecosystem of science diplomacy? What actors, either enforcing or reinforcing those that exist, or new actors. I think it's important in context of countries, not like the US, because in the US you have these actors, the way that they are now active or not is a different question, but you have an ecosystem, the very long tradition of science advice, science diplomacy, science policy interfaces. But in countries that do not have this broad variety of actors, how can we promote those? And what is a specific role of the young scientists in that process? This is open for anyone that wants to answer.
So if I may, I think one of the things that you need from my perspective, again, you need that coincidence between an official government partner, foreign minister, like Cancilleria or whoever it may be, but also you need someone outside of government that could ensure that you have high scientific standards, that you have the right kind of people, and then you can do that cross-fertilization that I was talking about, that perhaps the AAAS fellowships and others facilitate. You can't have, in my mind, one without the other. And they need to act as a counterbalance to each other to ensure that you have quality people, that you have, you avoid the over-politicization of the fellows, as Marga mentioned at some point during her remarks. And then from there, you know, you can have other actors that complement. But I think at the very least, you need government and non-government actors to ensure that you can have that bridge and create that bridge that allows people to go in and out of government science policy, science diplomacy role.
And on that note, I think it's also, for instance, the diplomatic system in each country can differ quite a bit, right? So there are countries with a lot more stricter pathways than others. So for instance, you can have in the US, you can send a scientist as an embassy fellow, for instance, for 3 months or 6 months, and then that person can go back to academia or whatever the job they had before. But in other countries, there are very strict rules and limitations as to who can even sit in a government office as an intern, right? And so this flexibility of career paths, I think it's important to, perhaps for Cristina, to give us a bit of an insight. Like in Spain, the diplomatic career is very linear, perhaps, right? So how can countries, not Spain specifically, but how can countries provide these flexible structures for people to go in and out and be exposed, rather than having to, you know, if you are a scientist and you don't want to perhaps be a diplomat, but you want to be involved in the processes. So how can we foster that? This is a question from Chile, but I think it's relevant for most countries that don't have the structures yet.
Well, I think we need to strike the balance between the need for some sort of specialization, and this is, you know, this is very easy to understand. You have judges, and you have diplomats, and you have you know, high level civil servants, and you need to have certain career path for them, and some level of specialization. But that can be combined with some sorts of flexibilization in order to allow for other people to, you know, to contribute and to participate in the diplomacy work. And, you know, the Embassy of Spain in Washington is very big. We have here representation from, I mean, we are probably the minority, the career diplomats. We have many other civil servants who are specialized in trade, in education, in home affairs issues. And then we have also, like we've had in the past, and I truly believe that we will have it in the future again, scientists who are here on a temporary basis, providing advice and helping us foster the you know, the cooperation between our scientific communities, and also our scientific relationship with the US. I think this is essential, and we should keep an open mind, and we should explore areas that maybe have not been explored to the same extent in Spain yet, but I'm sure there will be in the future, like, for example, public-private partnerships. I think the importance of the private sector in science is evident to everybody. And we're seeing this with the development of treatments and vaccines against COVID. We should So be an open mind and allow for spaces of cooperation inside public service and inside public institutions such as Spanish businesses abroad. We should allow for spaces of cooperation and interaction with the academia and with the private sector as well. I would like to go back to one of the, if I'm allowed, one of the questions that were asked previously about the importance of information. And I think this pandemic has shown us once again the importance of timely, accurate information that is provided to the public in the appropriate way. And how this crisis, with all the human pain that it has brought about and all the economic suffering that is bringing about, that will bring, in turn, will bring more human pain, the risk to breach the trust in your government is very obvious and is there. And I have seen that the role of the scientists in coming out to the public and explaining to the public, together with politicians or instead of politicians sometimes, I think is an essential role. And also all of us together, governments and scientific communities, fight misinformation, fight the manipulation and the misrepresentation of scientific data for other purposes. It is very damaging. It doesn't help in the fight against COVID. It hurts a lot, and in the end, it hurts people.
Thank you, Cristina. Alicia, you want to comment on the question?
I do. I agree with you, Marga, completely about flexibility. It's not that much about which actors are important. I think that the key is about the flexibility of these actors. And Cristina mentioned all the initiatives that are already happening to add this flexibility on the diplomatic side. And I have to say that this flexibility is still a work in progress in academia, because I think that right now, if you are in academia, there's no incentive to leave academia. Because if you leave academia, let's say for a year, to be in an embassy, being a science attaché in an embassy for a year, and then you have to go back to academia, that's a whole year that you have no publication. And you're going to be penalized for that. And if you want to pursue a career in academia, you don't want penalties for doing other things related to science. And right now, the reality is that if you have a gap in publication, that's against you and against getting more grants and getting more fellowships. And the evaluation of academics right now is basically the number of publications that they have and where do they have these publications. And it's not only about leaving academia to do something related with science policy or science diplomacy. This is a historical problem, for instance, for women in academia, right? If you have kids, for instance, and you decide to leave academia for a little bit to raise your kid, it is virtually almost impossible to go back to academia. And so I think that we need to also add a big component of flexibility on the academic side for researchers to feel that they want to contribute to these other aspects of the scientific community. Because right now they have very little incentive, and it's very much about if they have a passion for the topic or if they have a personal interest. And I think that this is a work in progress, not only in Spain, it is also a work in progress in the US and in the world.
Marga, if I may.
Yes, please, Fraile, I was going to ask you to comment.
This is precisely what I was mentioning, that Alicia brings the point that that's why you need those two partners. Because if you're going to have people do that bridge, and ideally it's a two-way communication and bridge, you need flexibility on both sides. You need the government partner to allow for a mechanism to bring people, fellows, give them whatever they need at the State Department. I had a diplomatic passport. I had all of the credentials that allow me to conduct my work. But then at the same time in academia, as Alicia mentioned, we need to have or give people the flexibility that if they want to go back, they're able to go back. To a point that Cristina discussed, I want to highlight, you're absolutely right when governments lose the risk of, or run the risk of losing faith by their citizens. Here in the US, of course, we're having some challenges, or maybe major challenges with that. But I still have a little bit of hope. I saw yesterday data from JP Morgan on consumer spending during COVID. And one of the things that comes out of that, it's that I jot some notes here to get it right, is that the spending patterns are similar in most states, regardless of their lockdown policies or political leanings. So in my mind, it means that people at a level are reading the science, understanding the science, and taking their own decisions regardless of whether or not the state decided to open, close, or do whatever it is. I would caveat that this is data from JP Morgan, and I don't know if the demographic into which they're giving their credit cards and that will have an impact. So it will be interesting, but at the very least, it shows that regardless of the political leanings of the state or the policies that are now have been politicized here in the US, individuals are taking matters in their own hands and making a decision. And that decision and the pattern of those behaviors look very different, look very similar, regardless of the place where they're making. So at least that gives me hope that people at a level are understanding the science and taking appropriate actions to protect themselves.
Great, thank you, Franklin. We're gonna go to the last question, which is from a very special person, our colleague, Dr. Bill Coglaser, who is the editor-in-chief of Science and Diplomacy. And he's asking a very challenging question, but I think it's a good one to close. And first I will say that he wrote, if you want to read something very, very good about science, diplomacy, and COVID, read his article, his editorial entitled The Catastrophic Failures of Science Policy Interface, something like that, Bill. So recommend that if you want to get, it's not a happy read, but he doesn't mince words, which is fantastic. So Bill is asking you, with the challenges of COVID-19, economic losses, conflicts between countries, and weakness in international cooperation, what is your top priority now for science diplomacy? You can take 5 seconds to think about it.
I think a top priority right now is to find a way to a vaccine and to respecting scientific procedures to find a way to a vaccine that is viable and that is available to everybody.
I think also following up on that, once we have the vaccine, there's also going to be a real need for scientists and governments to come together to ensure that every single person in the world is vaccinated. Everyone has access to a vaccine. Otherwise, if we don't do this together, it's not gonna work. If I get the vaccine and my neighbor doesn't get the vaccine, or the country to the north or the south, east or west of my country does not get the vaccine, we're going to be in this continuous lockdown and in this continuous challenge of economic losses and unfortunately loss of life and other things. So I think that once we have the vaccine, we all have a big challenge to ensure that everyone gets vaccinated, it is fair, equitable, and we don't continue to exacerbate the inequalities that COVID has highlighted that is disproportionately affecting underrepresented communities here in the US and around the world.
I think that for me, the challenge is to learn our lesson, first of all, to learn our lesson. We need an ecosystem for science diplomacy. COVID-19 has shown us that science is a key part of our life, and it's a key part of the solutions for global crises and challenges. So we need to learn that lesson, create an ecosystem that doesn't depend on which government is running a country, because we need to prepare for the next pandemic. This is not the last one. We need to prepare for the next pandemic, and also a way bigger problem than this pandemic is the climate crisis, and we also need to be ready for that. So I think that for me, my top priority, if I may, is to really put an effort in creating a robust and healthy science diplomacy ecosystem everywhere. But if it is not everywhere, at least in the country where I come from, to be ready for the next one.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for this very strong call to action. I think that's an excellent closing for this panel. Before we go, I will just read a message from our friend and colleague, Ana Elorza, that we've talked about her. So she's she's calling attention for everyone in the webinar to the S4D4C online course on science diplomacy, which is, it was mentioned by Cristina, the conference that happened in Madrid that that created this Madrid Declaration of Science on Science Diplomacy was from this European Horizon 2020 project consortium called S4D4C, Science Diplomacy for Global Challenges. And I'm part of that too. So we have just released a month ago, is it? Yeah, something like that, an online course on science diplomacy that has more than 3,000 people already that have registered, which is fantastic. It really shows the appetite and the interest in this topic now with COVID-19 more than ever. So this is one way to build capacity and to expose more people, both scientists, diplomats, and every other actor that Franklin mentioned that's necessary to bring into the conversation. So please go to the chat and to the Q&A, and you can directly click this link to the online course, and we hope to see you there. So on that, I will thank you, all three of you, Cristina, Alicia, and Franklin, for this wonderful panel, and thank you to the Embassy of Spain in Washington, to the Office of Cultural and Scientific Affairs for giving us this space. This will be recorded. This is being recorded, so it will be available on the channels of the Embassy. So stay tuned for that on Twitter, YouTube, and all the usual channels. And have a great weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.
Goodbye. Thank you very much to all of you. Bye-bye.
Gracias. Ciao.